The Saxon invasion is a lesson in the damage that a handful of weak leaders can bring to a people. The Brittonic elite's mistake in inviting foreign Saxons to Britain and continuing to let them in despite the Britons begging them to stop led to women and children being slaughtered in their homes like lambs by a pack of wolves. The Britons were a Celtic people that spoke a common tongue. They were made up of many tribes that lived alongside each other in relative peace across modern-day England and Wales. They led simple lives. Most of them slept in wooden huts and ate meat and milk from their animals. When Caesar and his army found them in 43 AD, the Romans were impressed by the health and vigour that emanated from these tall, wild barbarians. The Britons were a terrifying sight in battle. They would appear out of the woods suddenly with blue-painted skin, letting out a cacophony of shouts and blasts from their horns. Huge bronze trumpets topped with menacing animal heads stood high above the warriors, blaring an ominous wail as they charged on horseback and in chariots towards their enemies. These fierce Britons fought many battles as they resisted Roman invasion, but eventually Rome's might overpowered the fragmented Celts and forced them into submission for several centuries. Over time, the Britons were softened by the safety and luxury provided by Roman civilization. But when the Romans left Britain in the 5th century to retreat into their shrinking empire, the long peace left with them too. Suddenly, the Britons were forced to defend themselves against savage Picts and Scots who had been untainted by Rome's pacifying touch. At the first opportunity, these tribes rushed down from the north to steal the Britons' land, property, animals, and women. The Britons scrambled to man fortifications left behind by the Romans, but after relying on Roman strength for so many generations, they struggled to find men capable of defending their settlements. Inexperienced guards would visibly tremble as they stood at their posts, terrified of the hooked weapons the barbarians used to pull men from the walls to their death on the ground below. It wasn't long before cities lay deserted and fields were left ravaged. The Great Northern Wall itself was abandoned, left as a useless monument that the Picts would climb over with ease. The older Britons could still remember life under Roman rule, when their land had been rich and prosperous, where they could enjoy exotic wine and olive oil shipped in from Italy. Now, they couldn't even feed themselves. Those who could not hunt or fish, or convince others to share their spoils, went hungry. It was around this time that 3 longboats launched from Saxon land into the turbulent Northern Sea. Standing on the deck of the frontmost ship was Hengist, a broad warrior, his long hair billowing in the wind as the sea spray lashed at his hardened face. Hengist wasn't navigating using charts or landmarks. No, he used his instincts to direct the ships, trusting that Woden would bring them to the new land which their soothsayers had told them was destined to become Saxon. When the Saxons reached the shores of Britain, they were quickly met and escorted to the Briton king named Vortigern. Hengist and his brother Horsa towered over Vortigern as they stepped forward to explain their situation. They were refugees, they claimed. Their homeland had become overpopulated and they had left to seek out a new home. They were looking for work in exchange for food and land. This was perfect timing for Vortigern. He and the other British nobles were failing to keep their land safe and so failing in their duty as leaders. How many more picked raids would the Britons take before they found themselves new rulers? During their discussion and bargaining, Vortigern soon realised that these Saxons were not a Christian people. They worshipped false godmen and women. But Vortigern was desperate and he struck a deal with the pagans nonetheless. The Britons would give the Saxons land and regular payments, and in exchange the Saxons would help defend the Britons from attack. It was not long after the deal had been agreed that news arrived of a Pict army harassing the Britons' northern settlements. After many days' march through the wooded land, the Saxon and Briton army met the Picts on the field. The Saxons began to shout their war cries and charge the Britons with the same ferocity and energy with which the old Britons had once met Caesar. The Picts, who weren't used to such resistance, quickly turned and fled, and the Saxons chopped them down as they ran. All the while, the downtrodden Britons stood aside, uselessly watching the Saxons fight on their behalf. After the battle, Vortigern was delighted, and he paid the Saxons as was agreed. The Saxons then rode back to their motherland to tell them of the richness of the land and the weakness of the Britons. For many years the Saxons continued to defend the Britons from the northern tribes, and the Saxons continued to bore in with the elite's blessings. Vortigern even gave gifts to the new arrivals. But the regular Britons were beginning to fear the growing presence of the Saxons. They felt threatened by the alien people who laughed at the Britons' Christian faith and sacrificed to false gods. They were afraid the Saxons would soon turn against them, and they warned that Brittonic culture itself was being weakened as the Saxons married Briton women, taking them away from their faith and traditions. Vortigern ignored his people's pleas. The Saxons preyed on his naivety, and the boats continued to land. As the Saxons grew confident in their numbers, they began demanding higher payments from the Britons. Vortigern was in a weaker position than ever, and so he kept agreeing with their demands to increase their pay. This went on until it grew to such a ludicrous amount that finally the king had to tell the Saxons that he could no longer afford their fees. That's when the Saxons turned on their host. Suddenly, the once guardians of the Britons stormed into villages wearing chainmail shirts, wielding swords and spears. Without mercy, they cut down men, women and children like they were mowing down reeds in a river. The terrified Britons ran to their churches for safety, sure that the Saxons would not dare murder them in their sacred temples. But the Saxons did murder. They slew the Britons as they cowered at their altars, killing priests and bishops and lay people alike, unfeelingly and without remorse, like foxes slaying hens. The churches that were so sacred to the Britons meant absolutely nothing to these foreign invaders, and the Britons had been foolish to think that they ever would. The Brittonic survivors fled to the desolate and remote corners of their country. They sheltered in mountain caves, thick forests and on barren islands. Some of them eked out an existence, but many couldn't find enough food and were forced to hand themselves over to the brutal Saxons. Oftentimes, the unpredictable Saxons would simply kill the poor Britons for fun as they begged for mercy. Those who weren't killed were taken as slaves, never to taste freedom again. After some time, the Britons regrouped and began to fight back against the Saxons. They were able to secure some of the wilder parts of the island, and indeed many Brittonic heroes led their people to victories. But alas, they were never to retake their heartland. As the Saxons forged new kingdoms on the land that the Britons had once called home, the Britons could only watch on in misery and curse the name of Vortigern.